So today, with a few more minutes, is HaAtzmaut. It's the day of Israel's independence, and therefore we decided to talk a little bit about Israel and to give kind of like, I think it's a little bit ambitious to try to give the entire history of Israel in an hour, but we'll try to do somewhat of an overview of the centrality or the importance of Israel in Jewish philosophy and Jewish practice and Jewish thought, in the Jewish mind, really, the Jewish consciousness. Jerusalem is as at the center of our prayers, and it has been for 2,500 years. Israel is in the yearnings of every Jew. Every Jew. It's our prayers. That's what it has been. So I want to talk a little bit about that and what the significance is, what the meaning of it, and also a little bit about kind of the history of Israel. And I want to highlight some important pieces and also bring it not only from times immemorial, but also in the modern state of Israel and Zionism, and kind of also dealing with some of the major themes that happens with the Jewish people in Israel, but also some of the major compromises that were made during the foundation of the state to make sure that there's unity, because you have so many different Jews from so many different parts of the world, converging upon Israel, and a lot of very important decisions were made, a lot of compromises were made to make sure that everyone's happy and they don't have civil war, which would be disaster. Because as we know, if we learn Jewish history, we find that civil war has indeed happened in Israel, and it was a disaster. It happened more than once. And if we think about the idea of Israel and the idea of Jewish unity, and today's the day where we celebrate it. And it brings Jews together. That's the one thing more than perhaps more than any other that unites Jews across the world, across different the spectrum of observance or even affiliation or Jews. What do we feel? What do we feel proud of? Israel is our little baby. We may have never visited it. We may not know much about the history. We can't speak Hebrew, whatever, but we're still proud of Israel. That's a very important thing for global Jewish unity. So let's first start off with kind of the classical perspective or place that Israel has in Jewish thought. So we'll start with the beginning of the Torah, Genesis, right? So you read Genesis, and you know that Genesis is the first book of the 5 books of the Torah. And the very first commentary of Rashi on the Torah, on Genesis, he asks a fundamental question. And he says, essentially, the question is like this. If you were to take the entire Torah, and it's on a Google Doc, or it's on a Microsoft Word document, or some sort of word processor, I don't know what processor people use here, and you would just take Genesis and say, Control All, and then just delete it. Like, what would happen? How would that change everything? Because essentially, the book of the Torah is a book of instructions for Jews. That's what it is. You open up Genesis, and you look for instructions, and you know what? You don't find any. Well, you may find some. You find be fruitful and multiply. You find circumcision, even though circumcision is repeated later. In fact, in this week's parsha, it's repeated. And you find another one of not eating a certain part of the animal, the sciatica. That's it. 12 parshios, 12 sections, enormous detail and dialogue and narrative, and where's the instruction? So Rashi asks the question, we're about to start Genesis, we're about to start the Torah. This is the book of instructions. Why do we should just start from where the mitzvahs start, from when the instructions start, in the middle of Exodus? We should start from the story of, okay, now get yourself the animals and prepare for the Exodus and make the matzah and the whatnot. That's his question that he asks. So he says, the answer is false. The reason why we have to have that whole narrative, the Genesis and Adam and Eve and Abraham and Isaac and Noah and all those stories is about Israel. Why? Because the culmination of the Torah, the Jewish people, once we have the Torah, right? We got the Torah, and then where do we go after we got the Torah? To Israel. The nation that is going to be formed and molded by the Torah, that exists in its purity in Israel. Thus, we have to know all of this as a prerequisite because this is our deed, so to speak. The deed that we have of Israel is Genesis and the story about Abraham and God telling Abraham, you'll have Israel, God telling Isaac and Jacob, repeated it again and again. Israel is ours. So think about that. what does that tell us about the importance of Israel as the Jewish country or the Jewish place, the Jewish home in Jewish thought? It tells us that we will dedicate 25% of the Torah, and every word is cherished. We know that there's some laws that are taught because of one letter. Every word of the Torah, every letter is cherished. Every letter is very important. We're going to dedicate all that to say that the Jews have Israel. How important is Israel in Jewish life? Not only that, we talked about mitzvos. Who wants to guess how many mitzvahs are only applicable in Israel? I don't know the exact number, but I know for sure it's more than 100. We're talking about like 20, 25% of mitzvahs only apply in Israel, right? Yes, that's it. You can't do them. There's many mitzvahs you cannot do in the United States. A lot of them you still. As an example, the laws of Shemitah, or Yovel, or building in the temple. It's a nice example, right? You can't build it in Houston. Too far. I'm not going all the way to Israel. Let's build a local one. It's got to be in Israel. Many mitzvahs are all the agricultural laws, all the laws of purity and impurity, all the sacrificial laws, all the ritualistic laws that are surrounding the temple, all in Israel. Additionally, we find that our forefathers, they kept the Torah. This is one of Dave's favorite topics. The idea of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob keeping the entire Torah even before it was given. Right? It's your favorite topic? I'm not getting into this. So, if Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob kept the entire Torah, as we have many sources in Jewish literature that say that they did, we find that Jacob married two sisters. And the Torah says very explicitly that a man cannot marry two sisters. You can't. There's only one way. There's only one loophole. If you marry one of the sisters and then she dies, you can marry her sister. Right? But if you divorce her or whatever, you can't marry her sister. So Jacob is married to Leah and concurrently married to Rebekah. How is that possible? If Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob observed the entire Torah? The answer is that even though Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob observed the entire Torah, only in Israel did they observe the entire Torah. Thus, let's do the mathematics. Who did Jacob marry first? He married Leah first. Thus, who encroached upon the transgression of marrying two sisters? Which marriage? The marriage of Leah, the marriage of
Rachel.
Of Rachel, that's right. Thus, what happens? They come back to Israel, and they're on the doorstep of Israel. So who dies? Who dies? Right on the doorsteps of Israel. When Jacob's coming back with his family. Yeah. As they're about to get into Israel, Rachel dies. Why? Because he cannot be living with both of them in Israel. Because in Israel, he keeps the entire Torah. How crazy is that? How crazy is that? Pretty crazy, huh? What does this tell us? It tells us that even the observance of Torah, right? Obviously, before it was given, now it's different. But even the observance of Torah that Abraham Isaac only in Israel. There's something really special about the land of Israel, even going back to the times of Abraham, even before the Torah, before the conquest of Israel. Very interesting. Another thing another cool little anecdote about Israel, a little vignette, a little interesting tidbit about Israel. We're told, this is again in many sources, not in one particular source, but in many different sources, the idea of God's influence. In Jewish theology, we don't say that, God created the world and then God's off to other things, bigger and better things. We have the idea of God sustaining the world. The idea of God created, but but God didn't create something that to go on autopilot. It has to be continually sustained. It's called influence in the words of Jewish scholarship. God's influence, God's hashpa'ah. And it says that there's angels or certain spiritual forces that are filters. Thus, God's influence to a particular country or nation or state goes through a certain angel that's the filter. And if you ask the question, I know we're getting very off the topic of Israel, but if you ask the question of how come people from different countries have different, stereotypical characteristics. People from Germany are super organized, and people from Greece and Italy are super chilled out. Let's take a 5-hour siesta. We'll see you at 4, right? Yeah, there's certain stereotypes, and obviously it's stereotypes and generalizations, of course. But we could for sure agree that there are differences. Where do those differences come from? Just because you live in a different place, you're more, according to the Torah, it's because that every angel, i.e. every filter that God has to give over, to be the conduit that gives over God's sustaining lifeblood to that country, goes through a certain angel. Thus, it has a separate kind of quality. It's also a very interesting idea. That like the French and the South Africans and the Australians and the people from Chile, right? They all have different qualities because the influence that they get from God is through different angels. Like we meet the angel of Esau. Who remembers the story of angel of Esau? Jacob is battling with the angel of Esau, right? Esau is the nation of Edom. They have an angel. And somehow, however this works, but Jacob is battling with that. Who is the influence over Israel? Who is the filter through Israel? Huh? No, that hashtag no filter. That's right. That's absolutely right. Israel has no filter, right? Like verses says, the eyes of God are constantly watching Israel. Israel is kind of God's little baby. This is God's place. This is a place where God's influence is there without any intermediaries, without any spiritual forces being the pipelines. And that's the significance of Israel spiritually. Wherein Israel is a physical place. You go there, there's mountains and valleys, and there's deserts, and there's trees, and there's a climate and whatnot. It's a regular country. If you were to just look at a picture, maybe you'll see something that would tell you about Israel. Maybe not. But it's a physical land, and the temple was a physical building, and Jerusalem is a city. It's a real city. With traffic cops. It's a regular city. It's a physical entity, yet it has a spiritual quality. And the idea of Jewish spirituality is where something, you take a lulav and you shake it, well, it's a branch, and you're shaking an etrog, and that's a fruit, but it's physical themes. But in the right context, it has a spiritual element. If you eat matzah, I'll get to you in a second. If you eat matzah on Passover, right, you're eating food. It's food, but it's a mitzvah. How does that work? How does a physical thing take on a spiritual nature? Right? That's Jewish spirituality, wherein a physical activity or physical reality is uplifted into having a spiritual context. Right? Shabbat. What do we do on Shabbat? We sit around. We have massive meals. We eat mountains of challah. Right? We eat steak. That's what we do. That's what Shabbat is. Rabbi, that's a mitzvah. Yes. Right? What do we do before we eat any food? We make a blessing. What do we do with the blessing? The blessing is assigning this physical activity and now giving it a new spiritual reality. That's the idea. It's bridging this gap. It's taking the soul, the spiritual, and influencing the body, the physical. Thus, Israel, despite being a physical land, and it's going to have its own problems, and we'll go a little bit about the history of Israel. We'll talk about what happened when they conquest and what happened with the civil wars and what happened with the problems, but it is spiritual as well. It has the spiritual nature. That's what we talk about God being, this is God's land. This is the place that despite being physical and having all the hang-ups that come along with being a physical reality with problems like every other country, it's the place where God's influence, it could be most felt. It's a place where this physical reality has a spiritual nature to it as well. Dave.
Now, let's go back to one of the comments you made about people with certain characteristics living in the same lands. Was this done during the dispersion after the Tower of Babel? Did Hashem do that on purpose?
Well, that seems to be the formation of the 70 nation thing. Right. We have a theme that's streamed throughout many aspects of Jewish philosophy, that you have 70 nations, 70 languages, and Joseph speaks 70 languages, and the members of Sanhedrin speak all 70 languages, right? So that's the idea. That started at the Tower of Babel. I would guess that there's just like there's 70 angels over, governing the 70.
The correlation, isn't it?
Yeah, I like that. I'm okay with that. I'm not sure. I can't think of any source off the top of my head, But
we'll just call it the
more than
bargain
70
source.
languages.
We'll call it the bargain
yeah,
source.
that's true. But even today, the languages aren't. Most of them aren't original languages. Most of them are
But think
variants.
about it, he dispersed
Mixtures.
People
Chaucer
after
mixes
the
Latin with
Tower of Babel.
German with French, and you have English.
What'd you say?
Okay.
So every single land, Rabbi, has an angel sort of assigned to it.
Yeah, like
Except
angelic
Israel.
pipes. That's right.
Every
Absolutely.
other one. Okay.
So that's why Israel's so important. So what happens? So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they're promised that they're going to get Israel. Right? The land of Israel is part of the vision and the mission of the Jewish people. So they're in Egypt, of course. They have the Exodus. They spend how many days preparing for getting the Torah? 49 days after they left Egypt. 50th day they get the Torah. What do you need to be prepared to get the Torah? 49 days. How long do they spend preparing to go to Israel? 40 years. The entire process of what happens in the desert, in the wilderness, is a preparation. And you know what kind of life they're living? They're living this supernatural life. Their food is delivered to them via parachute every day, right? Their clothing grows with them, right? It never gets tarnished or it never gets worn out. They're surrounded by these clouds that flatten mountains and kill predators. And at night there's this fire. Like it's an incredible existence, right? They are soaking up a certain quality of a nation, right? They have Moses there, direct instruction from Moses, right? It's the purest generation, despite they had some flaws, of course. But this is the generation that's called the Dor De'ah, the generation of knowledge, because they got it straight from Moses. So they're living this kind of utopian, supernatural existence. 40 years later, Moses dies. There's a new leader, it's Joshua. Moses never makes his way into Israel. He prays and prays and prays and prays and prays. In fact, he prays in total 515 times to get admitted into the land of Israel. God says no. And after 515 times, Moses stops because God tells him, if you pray one more time, I'm going to have to give in to you, but then I'll have to destroy the world. Moses accedes, Moses dies, they enter Israel. What do they find in Israel? What's the nature of the people living in Israel at the time of the beginning of the conquest? Well,
There were a bunch of
yes. So we're talking about 31 different kings or different tribes, 7 different nations. Right? It's chaos. Right? They begin a war of conquest. It takes them 7 years to get a foothold. Another 7 years to divvy up the land. But essentially, for another 400 years, they're going to be living in a state where the Jewish people are there. They're the majority, of the population there, but they're going to have constant skirmishes with their neighbors. They don't have Jerusalem yet. They have the Philistines, the nemesis of the Jewish people at that time. The group of Philistines. By the way, that name will be revived as the land of Israel, as Palestine was revived twice. It was revived by Hadrian when he renamed Israel, which was called Judah at the time, renamed it Philistinia, after that extinct Philistines that existed in the times of the judges that Solomon battled with. And then in the British Mandate, after the World War I, when they finally captured Israel out of the hands of the Ottomans, they renamed it Palestine as well, reviving that once again that dead name. Thus, the Palestinians today have literally zero to do with the Plishtim that existed in the times. Literally nothing, absolutely nothing. They still don't exactly, they're Jordanians. They're not part of this. It's not like but there's a misconception that's breeded. Well, the Palestinians or Palestine has been a name associated with this land for a long time, but has not been contiguous. It hasn't been ongoing. So that's where they are. So they get into Israel, and they have this kind of rocky couple hundred years. And it's like unfortunate where 500 years of Jewish history is all narrowed down to one soundbite. But that's what it was. It was this struggling time where they had no king, they had prophets, they had judges, but there wasn't the completion of the Jewish conquest and the Jewish kind of settlement in the land was not complete. Then we meet a fellow by the name of Saul, and Saul's going to start to change everything. Right? Saul's going to become king. He's not going to last that long, but he's going to usher in a new form of leadership for the Jewish people that's going to be around for hundreds of years, and that is the monarchy. Unfortunately, Saul is the wrong guy for the job, and after 2 years, that mantle is given over to King David. And we find this again and again and again, another pattern in Jewish leadership, but also in Israel. We'll show this again in modern Israeli Zionism. We find that the people that are perhaps arguably the least or the worst candidates to be the leaders are the ones who are going to be the leaders. It means the leadership in Israel is oftentimes going to come from very unexpected sources. Right? Yes.
I remember from my home, my grandparents, that I never heard Israel before 1948 when I was still a little girl. But I always heard Palestine. And part of my family, I'm from Poland.
Yeah.
Part of my family left before I was born Palestine. And all of them survived.
That's what it was called. It was called Palestine. I had.
But I never heard. As I said, I heard in 1948 when Israel was kind of created. But so why we're talking now about Israel 400, 500, 2,000 years ago?
Yeah, because we're talking about the land of Israel. They had different names. It was called Canaan. That was a name for it as well. We're talking about the land of Israel that's today the land of Israel. It goes under many names, like under the British Mandate from I think it was 1917 to 1948. It was called Palestine. Then it was called Israel. It was called Judah for a while. It was called Judah and Israel. It means the southern kingdom of Judah, the northern kingdom of Israel. So it has multiple names. In fact, different parts of Israel are named after when Joshua settled, or at least for the time being, settled the land. They took it and split it into 12 different parts. Thus, every one of the tribes got a portion of Israel, and that portion was named after that tribe. So the tribe of Dan was called the Dan region today is still after that. But Judea and Samaria, if you ever hear that term, we don't call it the West Bank of the Jordan River. It's called Judea and Samaria. Why? Because the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Shimon, right, Samaritans, that was the part of Israel that was allotted to them. Thus, the Jewish name. You go ahead.
I heard this some time ago, and I don't remember who told me, but it's stuck here, that when the Palestinians say that this is their land, they said that they don't have the letter P to pronounce. They were calling themselves
Philistinia?
Yeah, something like that. They never were Palestinians. Now they probably know how to say it, but for years they couldn't pronounce.
Yeah, the Arabs can't pronounce the P sound. It's called the beast process. That's the peace process. It's called the beast process. So it's interesting, but I'm not going to try to say that there were no Arabs living in Israel. Of course there were lots of, and many of them were also itinerant, were gone. You know, they were landowners, but they weren't living there. In fact, in modern times, even 150 years ago, Israel was a very barren land. There was almost no one living there. Very few people living there. It wasn't producing anything. It was like almost an afterthought, really, for about 2,000 years. You know, from the time of the destruction of the second temple, a couple hundred years later, once the Jews kind of left and went to Babylon, went to North Africa, went to Persia, went to Europe, Israel kind of was in disrepair. So they tried to then it was captured by the Muslims, and then there was the Crusades over Israel, and a lot of things happened. But Israel as a vibrant, viable land, we don't find till this past century. And you had some Jews living there. You had some Arabs. There was always Jewish people, a small contingency, but there's always been some Jews living in Israel, but not major. There were major efforts, let's say in the 13th century, Jews to move to Israel. In the 17th and 18th century, the first Yishuv, there was lots of Jews that went there. Of course, in the 19th century and of course the early 20th century, that obviously picked up in a major way. But yes, I would agree. There were lots of Arabs there, and there were some Jews there as well throughout the times. However, the land of Palestine as a nation, and even Arabic nationalism at large, is a brand new thing as well.
Who is the person that formed the Arab nation?
What Arab nation?
How did these Arabs come about?
Arabia is a region. I mean, there's Arabs and then there's Muslims, right?
Yeah.
Right. So there are some Arabs that are not Muslims. They're Christians. There's Christian Arabs. There's Druze in Israel. The Druzim. They're Arabs, but they're not Muslims. And there's some Muslims that are not. There's a lot of American Muslims. There's the Turkey is a Muslim country, but they're not Arabs. They're Turks. They're ethnically different people. The biggest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia, and they're very, very, very far from being Arab. But Islam was started by an Arab merchant in the early 7th century. Therefore, it gained very popular in that part of the world. Thus, it's associated to Islam. The religion and the people are linked together. But Arabs, even before Islam ever shows up, we find in the Talmud accounts of Arabs. There were lots of nomads and wandering and living in tents and fathering lots and lots of babies. That personality, that kind of ethnic individual is found even in sources way before Islam. So that's so the Arabs are people that are native to Arabia. So we're saying a pattern that we'll find in leadership of Israel is that we'll find that someone like King David who was considered to be an afterthought. And he had six brothers, and he was the weakest of them all. He was this redhead that everyone would grab his head and do this to him. But that was the high point. And you have 80 years through the times of King Solomon, King David's son, which is considered the epitome of the Jewish people. The Jewish people had it all. They had it spiritually, they had it physically, they had a monarchy, they had peace, they had prosperity, they had stability, everything that you would want. And it was so good, in fact, for the Jews at that time, that they didn't accept converts. Someone came to convert to the Jewish people. You know what they would say? Sorry, buddy. It's too good for us, right? And we're worried that maybe there's an insincere conversion because, you know what? King David and King Solomon figured it out. That the nation was peaceful, was prosperous, it had everything. So anyone comes to convert, well, who says they're coming because they genuinely wanted to join the Jewish people? Maybe they just want all the goodies that come along with this wonderful, prosperous nation that existed at the time.
It's still very difficult to become a Jew.
Well,
this is my family. My grand-nephew married a Peruvian lady. And on her own, we didn't ask her. She decided to become a Jew. And the religion is Roman Catholic. And she had to convince the rabbi who finally decided to take her.
Yeah.
It took them 3 years. So now it's a dilemma. They want to marry because they were not very young. He was 4 years old and she was 37. She was one child, very bad. So finally they decided to get married, and she was still going, and she's a better Jew than I.
Was it an Orthodox conversion?
Huh?
Was it an Orthodox? Or do you know that?
You know what? I even didn't ask. I was so taken by this woman and her whole family who took this so beautifully, they agreed, and it was just our older brother. This is the same thing, go ahead. So, good luck here. Mm-hmm. So now the little boy is a Jew, and he probably I know that it's an Orthodox because some things I don't understand. But the nice family.
Very
I
interesting.
read it out of them.
So,
They didn't want converts.
well, they did. That's not what they wanted converts. It's just they were never could never be sure that they could verify that someone wasn't insincere about it.
Rabbi,
Either
was
way.
this a spiritual time?
Oh yeah, big time.
It was?
Big time. King David, read the books of Psalms, read the books of
Proverbs?
yeah, the books of the books that were written at that time by King David. These were intensely spiritual people. These were prophets. Remarkable individuals. This is when David captures Jerusalem. It actually purchases Temple Mount. Finally, all of Greater Israel is in Jewish hands. He doesn't get to build a temple. King Solomon builds a temple, and things are fantastic. And that lasted 40 years. That's it. Solomon dies, and we find the first civil war, basically. It wasn't really a war. It was more like a standoff or a Cold War. But we find a schism that changed the course of Jewish history. Solomon dies. His son, Rechavam, becomes the king. He makes a few poor choices. He decides to tax the people that live in the north part of Israel. Remember, Jerusalem's in the southern Israel. So you have people that feel like they're out of place. They're like in the rural parts, and they don't feel like that intense association with the people in the capital. And instead of trying to court them, he makes the fatal flaw of taxing them very strongly. They secede, and from then on, for the next 180 years, we have two kingdoms. Kingdom of Israel in the north, kingdom of Judah in the south. And in fact, the kingdom of Israel in the north descended into idolatry and sin very, very rapidly. They built temples to idols, and eventually they were destroyed by the Assyrians under the leadership of Sancheriv, and they're gone. Where are they? These are the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Have you ever heard of the 10 lost tribes? That is the kingdom of Israel in the north. They have disappeared, and they maybe appear every once in a while, or claims from people.
Then who went to Babylon?
Babylon's later.
Later?
Yeah. So we find this tragedy. There's all the words to describe it. You have Israel and you have disunity. You have Israel and you have discord. We have Israel and we have schisms. We have Israel, we have factions. And what happens? Disaster, destruction, and exile. And in fact, we have a significant portion of the Jewish people are now gone. We don't know where they are, and there's debates on whether they'll ever come back, and who knows. So that is an example of what happens. Israel, like we said, it's a spiritual land, and it's very welcoming to Jews, provided that they're living as Jews should. Once they decide to do idolatry, once they decide to have internal fighting, once they are not living in the state where they need to be, when they are moving in different paths where there's not unity, that's it. You have no right to live in Israel. You're done. They disappeared. The 10 lost tribes are gone. A couple hundred years later, we find the destruction of the first temple and the first exile to Babylon. What happened is that the southern kingdom of Judah, they had more righteous kings, they had righteous leaders, they had the temple, they were protected from the disaster, the spiritual and then eventual physical disaster and destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel. And they survived. However, they didn't survive entirely, and eventually the Babylonians came and they destroyed the temple, and they sent the Jewish people packing east. The Jewish people will go east. I'm going over a lot of history, literally, very, very fast, because I want to get to modern Israel before we're done here. It's already 8:08. So they are going to Babylon, and eventually they come back under the leadership of Ezra, right? So they have a 70-year intermission, and they come and rebuild the temple. But this is the second temple. The second temple is very different than the first temple. And from then on, you have the community in Israel being a minority. The vast majority of Jews decided to stay in Babylon. It was a very hospitable place for the Jewish people. And in fact, the Jewish people will be living in Babylon from about the year 400 before the Common Era till this most recent century. like in the 1950s, 1960s, there are still, even today, there's still small groups of Jews living in Baghdad, living in all these places, the Far East, not Far East, in the Near East, in the places where the Jewish people went to originally after the destruction of the First Temple. And in fact, if you open up the Talmud, you find all these discussions about the different communities. So you have Israel suddenly it's the center, it's the spiritual center of the Jewish people. It's what the temple is. It's what people converge upon when they make a pilgrimage to Israel during the holidays, during Passover. But it's no longer the place where the vast majority of Jews live. So we find all these fascinating discussions and interactions that would happen between these different communities. It's kind of like you have today. You have two centers of Jewish life and vibrancy, two major centers, of course, Jews living everywhere, but in the United States and in Israel. And they're kind of different. You meet Israeli Jews, and they're different, and you have interactions, and that's very interesting, and it's kind of fascinating. And you have a lot of stories in the Talmud. What would be when you have the Jewish people? Someone from Israel came to Babylon, and they would ask them all these questions, and they would talk to them, and it was like it was like these two cultures that would interact, and very interesting things would result. Second Temple is ultimately destroyed. Why is the Second Temple destroyed by the Romans? So it's actually interesting. You look at the foes, the central foes of the Jewish people, and it's constantly changing. Israel, we're here. We haven't, we have uninterrupted. We've existed since Moses. We know the names of all the people. This is a continuous nation. But then we started off, we had the Assyrians, and then we met the Babylonians, then we met the Persians, and then we met the Greeks, and then we met the different kinds of Greeks. We had the Macedonian Greeks and the Assyrian Greeks and the Ptolemite Greeks and the Seleucids, and then they're gone, and then the Romans are gone, and the Byzantines and the every couple hundred years we meet a new foe, but we survive remarkably. In the first century, what happened? So there's a lot of stories, there's a lot of backstories here, but the chief thing that happened that tore Israel apart was once again disunity, factionalism, infighting amongst the Jewish people. You meet the Sadducees, you meet the Hellenites, you meet the Hasmoneans, the late Hasmoneans, and how they invited Roman. And then you have the different groups and the different fightings, and no unity amongst the people. The Romans step foot in; they never leave. There is several escalations. Once again, the Jewish people splinter even further. Christianity starts off as one of these splinter groups of Judaism. But not only that, you have them. We mentioned already the Sadducees. We have groups called the Baitusim. We have other groups called the Sicarium. A lot of different groups that exist among the Jewish people. We have the Biryonim. All these groups. Obviously, the Pharisees we hear about. Huh?
How do you remember?
I'm making them up as we go along. And that just creates this melting pot of so many different groups and so much infighting, and it just collapses. There was a revolt in the year 66, and eventually the Romans make their way down south from Syria, sacking town after town, destroying towns, crucifying thousands upon thousands, right? Killing, raping men, women, child, blood flowing like rivers, and temples destroyed. Masada goes down in the year 73, and if you were to look at the Jewish people at that time, you'd say, "Hey, it's over."
How long
it's
did
over.
Rome have Israel? How long did they rule Israel?
They ruled Israel almost continually from the year 63 before the Common Era, when Pompey arrives, and Pompey is brought in actually to mediate a disagreement between the two sons of Queen Shlomzion. She was the last of the queens of the Hasmonean dynasty. He's brought in to mediate, and once the Romans come in, they never leave. It's like the overly invasive in-laws. They come in, they settle down, and they put down their badge, and we're not leaving. We're moving in, and you try to get them out, and they say, no, we're here to stay.
Can I relate?
But with the one exception, in the year 132, we have the Bar Kokhba revolt. And the Jews took over for a brief 3 years, and that did not end well. And in fact, the Hadrian came back and he squelched the rebellion in a terrible way. And the fall of Beitar and the killing of the 10 martyrs and just disaster. But from this point on, it's kind of like, when you look at an earthquake or a tsunami, there's the initial event, and then there's the reverberations that can happen much later. So we have like a 300-year pattern of different factions and different groups and different fighting and different disunity. And then you have massive explosion, temples destroyed. The Jewish people try to regroup and try to get back together, and they do so successfully. But then you have another one. Eventually, the Jewish people kind of pivot their way out of Israel. Hadrian makes Israel and Jerusalem the first Judenreich city in the world, first city that no place for Jews were not allowed to go into Israel, into Jerusalem. There's only one day a year that Jewish people were allowed to go into Jerusalem, and that was on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th day of Av, because that was a day of mourning. So in a spiteful way, it's you should go in, but you don't just to cry and commiserate over your state. The once mighty nation of Israel, the once proud temple that we had, the most beautiful building in the world, remarkable. Now it's a pile of rubble. But as we are wont to do, the Jewish people constantly regroup, they rebuild, and despite the fact that the Jewish people are no longer living in southern Israel, you still have a massive amount of Jews living in northern parts of Israel, in the Galilee, in Tiberias. That's where, in fact, they wrote the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the most significant compilation of laws in all of human history. Enormous project that's 1,000 rabbis over many, many, many years. A collaboration unlike any other, and if not for that one publication, we would not be here today. That's how important and pivotal it is. Once again, every sentence could be its own class. By the way, all the details on what happened.
Were they writing it in Israel? Were they
in Tiberias? Yes. But that's getting closer and closer to marking the point in time where the Jewish people were the Jewish life in Israel was almost negligible. Like we said, at all points in time, the Jewish people were in Israel. They were living there. There were some people living there, but the center of influence and the center of leadership and central authority and the core, the epicenter of the Jewish people moved on to Babylon. And they moved on to Babylon, and Israel became almost forgotten. And if you look at from the year 200, 300, 400, nothing. We don't find anything in Israel. A little bit. We still find the leftover stuff of the previous groups of people that were living there. But Israel is kind of forsaken by everyone, almost. It's going to show up again in world history by the Muslims, like we said, in the 7th century. The Muslims come back and they interpret one of the chapters, the 17th surah of the Quran, when it says Al-Aqsa, which means the far place. They interpret that. One of the guys, I think his name was Omar, one of these emirs or one of these Muslim dudes, interprets an ambiguous word in the Quran as referring to Israel, Jerusalem. So when it says in the 17th chapter of the Quran that Muhammad went on his flying horse, El Baruch, to the El Aqsa, which is the far place. So he's flying on the horse. This isn't a dream, by the way. Sorry, I forgot to create. Right? He has a dream that he went on his flying horse, and they went up to heaven, and he met JC, and he met Musa, and he met Ibrahim, and they were chilling out and whatnot. That was determined later on, not determined, or invented later on, as referring to Israel. The amount of times that the word Jerusalem or Israel appear in the Quran is a grand total of 0. Whilst in the Torah, the Tanakh, which was codified 1,000 years before Islam was even thought of as a religion. So the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, was written and completed 1,000 years before Islam ever shows up on the scene, mentions it 750 times. Right? Israel and Jerusalem. Or Jerusalem specifically, 750. Israel even more than that.
So during the Middle Ages, what was Israel?
So like we said, Israel was was
it nothing?
Israel was, like I said, it was in the Jewish people's yearnings. It was in our prayers. It was in our thoughts. It was part of our life as Jews. Half of the prayers that we do is about rebuilding Jerusalem and reinstituting the Davidic line, and that was the hope and the yearning of the Jewish people throughout the years.
But who lived in Israel?
From the Jewish perspective, almost no one.
No one.
There were some individuals that made these pilgrimages, and we have these stories of great heroism. We have, like I said, in the Middle Ages, there was one major effort to go reestablish a synagogue. The Ramban, Nachmanides, he moved to Israel. It seems like the Rambam, Maimonides, also wanted to go to Israel, but eventually ended up in Egypt and stayed there. It's a subject of great debate. What happened? Why did Maimonides not choose to go to Israel?
I read a biography. I read a biography of Maimonides, and it said that in the biography that I read that he did go there, but he found it to be kind of like a wasteland, and then he went to Egypt after that. I don't know.
So maybe he stopped off there. It's possible that he stopped.
He didn't want to stay.
He did not stay. That's true. In fact, the Rambam is buried in Israel, and there's some legends as to how he ended up there. Not necessarily ones that are historical, but maybe they're true, maybe they're not. Either way, he's buried in Israel, but he lived his life primarily from the age of 24 in outside of Cairo, in Egypt. But Ramban, he actually he made it to Israel with a bunch of his students, and in fact, we have a synagogue in the old city of Jerusalem called the Ramban Synagogue, and that synagogue has been rebuilt several times, but it's subterranean. Why is it subterranean? In fact, all four of the ancient synagogues in the old city are subterranean or underground, because the Muslims, they had laws, and they were in charge primarily over Israel from that time period, from the time of 600s till primarily. Obviously, the Crusades that had back and forth and the slaughter, whenever the Muslims and the Christians are fighting over, there's always one guy stuck in the middle, and that's the Jews. And we don't fare very well when that kind of clash happens. But either way, the reason why that all the old city synagogues are subterranean is because Islam has laws for dhimmis. Dhimmi is like a protected class, Dhimmi, I think is how it's spelled. And that is monotheists, but not Muslims. So they're second-class citizens, but they're not quite as bad as pagans or non-believers in monotheism. But one of the rules is that they're in an Islamic world, in an Islamic country, an Islamic state, the Jewish synagogues have to be underground. Pretty crazy. The next time we find a major migration to Israel, or at least a major camp, was in the 18th century. We have in the 16th century, we have the establishment of the major Jewish center in northern Israel, in Sfat. So people like the Arizal, Rabbi Luria, people like the author of the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Cairo, right? It's spelled Karo or Caro. Also, a very fundamental, pivotal, crucial character in Jewish history. He lives in Israel, and that's the germination of that community. And then in the 18th century, you have the Vilna Gaon, the Gaon of Vilna, the genius of Vilna. He sets out to go to Israel. And once again, another time where a great Jewish leader starts heading towards Israel, stops, turns around, no one has any idea why, and goes back to Vilna, which is either in Poland or in Belarus or Lithuania. Depends. It's right. It's the most disputed.
War, right?
Yeah,
Right.
it's disputed territory. And then we meet the Zionists. I also want to talk about the Zionism a little bit.
When
Zionism.
was Akiva?
Who?
Rabbi Akiva and his students. When were they there?
Oh, Rabbi Akiva was there in the 1st and 2nd century of the Common Era.
And his 24,000 people that we mourn now,
That's right.
that's when they were.
Well, I don't know exactly when, but probably that was in the year, let's say in the 110s or 120s.
Okay, so that's what we have now. That's why we grow beards and all of this.
That's right. That's right. Look at that. I'm suffering every minute. So, we meet Zionism. Now, Zionism is very important to realize. Zionism is not a new idea. We just said the idea of Jewish life in Israel is not. Abraham had that idea, Isaac, Jacob, Moses. It's not a new idea. Modern Zionism is the modern effort to actually politically create that reality. But even that was not first done by the Zionists. There's, in fact, in the year 1825, there was a major effort to establish a Jewish state, but not in Israel. In fact, they were going to establish, where? Oh, not in Madagascar either. We'll get to that, in Uganda.
It was there, and they said, why we didn't take
You were there in
Nairobi.
1825?
Nairobi.
No. It was Uganda. But in 1825, there was an effort to make a Jewish country, a Jewish state in Grand Island near Niagara Falls. Very interesting. Yeah, Google it. It's there.
You know so much stuff.
So weird, right? But we meet a few things happen in the 19th century, in the 1800s, that are all going to come together in the end of that century to create modern Zionism. First of all, the 19th century was, in my opinion, the worst century in all of Jewish history. The worst. Oh, no. Well, the 20th was also pretty bad. But I would argue that the 20th is leftovers from the 19th. The writing was on the wall in the 19th century. In fact, you have 250,000 Jews in the 19th century converting to Christianity. Unheard of. Well, not in Spain, in France, in Germany, in all these places. Spain wasn't the center of Jewish life already for hundreds of years, right? Spanish Inquisition is 1492. So that's already a long time. The golden age of Spain is from the year 800 to the year 1200. Maimonides, remember, he lived in Spain, but he left. In fact, he left the year 1150 because of the Almohads, the Almohads, the radical Muslims that came at that time, and they told the Jews, okay, you could stay and become Muslim. You could stay and we'll kill you, or you could leave. And you have like a half hour to choose.
Yeah.
Pretty crazy.
How is that different today?
It's pretty crazy. So Maimonides and his family fled. Maimonides was 15 years old. They went to first Fez in Morocco, and then they ended up spending time in the Atlas Mountains for 9 years in northern Morocco. And then they went, and at the age of 24, Maimonides ends up in Egypt, and that's where he lived for the rest of his life, till the year 1204, when he died at the age of 69. Either way, so Zionism. So we have the 19th century caused assimilation on a scale and a rapid rate beyond anything we can even imagine. We think of today, well, there's so much assimilation and so many Jews that are so disengaged from Judaism and so much disassociation, and the kids aren't becoming members and whatnot. We can't fathom what was happening in Europe in the 19th century. It was so much worse than it is today. It was terrible. And in fact, today I would argue that the assimilation is more the product of ignorance and apathy versus the way it was of being anti, or being a rebellion, so to speak, against Jewish precepts that were accepted for thousands of years.
Rabbi, if they didn't assimilate, would they have been expelled?
I don't know. That's a hypothetical. I don't know. I don't think I have the tools to answer that question. However, once again, we do find patterns. We do find patterns that have repeated themselves again and again. So it's a good argument to say that when the Jewish people are doing what they need to be doing, then we'll be in good hands. And we find it, like we said, we talked about Spain. 300 years of just absolute. It's called the Golden Age of Spain for a reason. Yeah. It's not called the Silver Age or the Bronze Age. The Golden Age. Why? Because the people there had it all. They had the political recognition. They had strong and centralized authority. They had commitment to Torah and to Torah values, and that's why they flourished. That's what happens. And I think that's going to happen in Israel again. This is part of what I wanted to say tonight. How Israel is kind of collecting the pieces of what was left of the Jewish people. Modern state of Israel. So what's the story about the formation of the state? So then we know the backstory of Herzl. So Herzl, this guy is totally assimilated. We can't imagine how distant he is from Judaism, right? In fact, they found in Herzl's diaries in the year 1890. So the first Zionist Congress is the year 1897 in Basel, Switzerland.
Good guess.
Not bad. So a mere 7 years before, Herzl convenes this massive convention. Jews from all across the world heard about it and galvanized the Jewish people. Right? Let's committed to building a state. He writes a book called Der Judenstaat, right? The Jewish state. And he says, after this conference in Basel, he says, we built the Jewish state. That might not happen now, but for sure in 50 years. And in fact, 51 years later, the state was announced. Right? 7 years later, what was he writing in his diary, Herzl? Herzl wrote as follows. Herzl says that the solution to the quote-unquote Jewish problem is mass conversion to Christianity. And he describes, let's make parades, let's invite all the princes and noblemen of Europe, and let's have a fancy ceremony. That's what he wrote in his diaries, which is, what? This is the guy, this is the profile of the Savior. So not the Savior, of course, I don't want to argue he's the Savior, but this is the guy who's going to unite the Jewish people? Really? Really? This is what it looks like? You would think. But once again, we find again, very surprising. And in hindsight, yes, he did. Kind of. You can't argue that point. He kind of did. And he invested his entire life. He died at the age of 44, right? Penniless. And out of, why? Why did he die? You know why he died? Hard work. That's the only reason why he died. Hard work. He gave his life up to build Israel, to build Zionism. But out of nowhere, he couldn't speak Hebrew. He didn't keep a single mitzvah. He probably never saw in his life at tefillin.
No religion in it.
Nothing. In fact, he proposed that the official language of the state of Israel should be German. That's right. He had this utopian vision of what Israel's going to be like fancy ladies, and there was to be strolling around drinking coffee. Like, he had this vision of what it's going to be, this wonderful state of Israel. And in fact, we find that he wasn't even thinking about Israel. He was thinking any state. Give us Madagascar, you said, but he wanted Uganda. In fact, Herzl threatened the year 1904. Herzl, because what happened was that the governments of Europe offered to Herzl, we'll give you a massive tract of land in Africa, called Uganda, which is in western Kenya.
Well, we would have done great there.
And it's empty land, it's fertile land. You guys could go, and it's enormous.
Oh, yeah, that's real well.
And he's like, hey, that's an amazing idea.
Oh, yeah.
And he's like, okay, check, it's a big land, it's empty now, and we could go there and build our own, it'd be great. Because in his head, he wasn't thinking at all about Israel, and he wasn't thinking about the 2,000-year-old yearning to once again go back to Israel. He wasn't what he was thinking about. And in fact, when they brought it up to the Congress, and he was all alone, basically, it was him and Max Nordau. That's it. He threatened to quit. He said, "I'm out. If you guys don't accept, I'm out." Yeah. But remember, 1905, he's dead already, and Zionism takes life on its own.
So I'm confused. He writes in his diary that the best thing that Jews can do is convert.
Well, in the 1890. That's right. He made that proposition. He advocated.
Sees the light.
We don't know what happened. We don't even know. Remember, we don't even know if his wife was Jewish. We have no idea. There's doubts whether his wife was Jewish. He didn't give his kid a bris. He didn't give his kid a bar mitzvah. Like nothing. He wasn't.
He's held in such high.
Well, because of what he did. Means, but how did he start off? It's a fact. It's a fact that despite the fact that Herzl himself had a brit milah, of course, and had a bar mitzvah, his own son Hans had neither, and his son, in fact, this Hans guy, converted to Christianity. You know that? And then he went back to Judaism, and then he committed suicide. And his daughter died in the camps in the Holocaust, and his only grandson also converted to Christianity and also committed suicide in Washington, D.C. in 1946. So by the time, this is a very tragic epilogue to the story, but by the time the modern state of Israel is established, none of Herzl's descendants they're all dead. They're all gone, and it's just a really bad epilogue. But, like we said, Herzl's this incredible character, his great intelligence, his great charisma. He was, his energy, he's handsome, very tall, very beautiful, lots of massive beard. I don't know what's the deal with the beard, but he had this massive, massive beard. But part of the intelligentsia, but nothing to do with what we would consider to be traditional Judaism. And he proposes this idea. It takes on, of course, the The backstory we know, the Dreyfus affair. He was a journalist in France, and he was sent to cover the Dreyfus affair. And he realized that there's no place for the Jewish people in Europe. Dreyfus was a Jewish captain who was wrongly accused, and fabricated evidence for documents and whatnot that he traded secrets to Germany. He was paraded through the town. Everyone's screaming "Death to the Jews!" Like this massive controversy swept all of Europe. And he's there. Herzl's like, what's the deal? Like, we tried to assimilate and we tried to be like the Gentiles, and look, the parading the Jew, death to the Jew. What's the deal? So he came up with the idea that said that we cannot exist or coexist in other people's lands. We have to have our own. That was the idea. Writes the book. The idea takes on a life of its own. It spreads like wildfire. And we find that Zionism at the beginning had two vastly different camps behind the idea. You had the traditional Jews, the Jews that prayed every day, the Jews that were not part of the intelligentsia of Europe, but the decent, the honest, the peasants even of Europe, the Jews that were, that had the traditional perspective on Israel and rebuilding the temple and all these vast ideas that are part of Jewish thought for millennia. That's one faction. And they had a hard time. There was this tension because you see Herzl's the leader, and like, dude, the guy doesn't even know like anything. Like, can't read heat. Like, and this is the guy. And in fact, Herzl kind of liked these guys. He called them his army of schnorrers. That was the name that he had for those Jews, the Eastern European Jews who just wanted to go back to Israel. And then he had the secular Jews that were totally secular, that were also behind it, but for very different reasons. More like Herzl's, like let's have a state, let it be totally independent of any kind of the traditional perspective of a Jewish state. But those two factions, if we look at what exists today in Israel, we just had elections, we could kind of see that those two factions still really exist. The religious Zionists that talk about having all of Israel, not giving up a single inch. Why? Why are they like that? Because they are living with the kind of almost messianic vision of what Israel ought to be. We're taking back our land. It's not just about having a convenient place where all the Jews can live. It's our land. Let us build our land out. Why should we give it away to the Arabs? And then you have the people that are not attached to Israel in the same religious sense, if you will, but more in a more nationalistic stance. So they would argue, hey, it's more pragmatic to maybe negotiate on something like that. And for the other camp, well, that's non-negotiable. This is Israel. We can't negotiate for Israel. So kind of those two groups, they united under one banner. And even though there was and still is tension, I like to look at Israel as being sweeping all the Jews from all different groups and all different backgrounds under one banner. Originally, there were also two different groups of anti-Zionists. The early Reform Jews in France and Germany and the United States were very, very anti-Zionism. Because Zionism conflicted with a core precept, a core tenet of early Reform philosophy. In fact, in 1885, the Pittsburgh Platform was a articulation of what it means to be a Reform Jew. And it says as follows here, quote, this is a direct quote, it was written in English, and it was accepted by all the Reform communities, all Reform Judaisms. Obviously this was adapted, this was changed, but this, just reading this little piece will tell you about what the attitude was of the Reform Jews. Quote, we consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine, nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state. Right? This was a repudiation of the Jewish principle, Jewish tradition of going back to Israel. So what happens? A mere 12 years after this declaration by the Convention of Reform Rabbis in the United States, Zionism is born. There's movement to go back to Israel. They said, no, that's anti-Jewish, which is ironic, I guess, in hindsight. But that was the argument. And in fact, in Houston, in 1944, so years and years later, we have a split between Bethel and Emmanuel, the two major Reform synagogues here.
Israel.
Right? What did I say? What did I say?
Bethel.
I apologize. We're in Bethel right now. Beth Israel and Emmanuel.
46.
It was 44. I think it was 44. Maybe it's 43. And that was a split over support of Zionism. Means even as late as the 40s.
How do you know this?
Huh?
How do you know this?
It's common knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, well, you can read about it. Read about it online even.
Did you people know about this?
Yeah.
It's very interesting that was one of the groups that at least originally, of course, they changed it. We have the Columbus platform of 1937, which changed the entire perspective. But originally, when Zionism started, that was the reform, and those minded people. The reform today, reform then is very different. Of course, very important to realize that. But they were against Zionism, and additionally, you had the super religious Jews, the super Orthodox Jews, that they were also against it. Once again, unlikely bedmates. What do they say? Bedfellows. Strange bedfellows. Thank you. Wherein they were too worried that
Secular.
the religious anti-Zionism was based on the fact that, okay, we're going to build a state. What kind of state? Is it going to be a Jewish state with Jewish law and halacha and Shabbat and everything? Or should it be a secular state? Well, if it's going to be a secular state, according to those people, well, then we're better off not having it. Let's live in Europe, let's live in the United States, let's live wherever. Because to them, the idea of rebuilding Israel and rebuilding this Jewish state, but not in the way that it's supposed to be ideally, well, that's anathema. So that group was also anti-Zionism. But I think today, if we look, fast forward 100 years later, everyone pretty much is, all Jews pretty much across all factions, even Jews that are not affiliated with anything, support Israel. You have obviously exceptions. You have, unfortunately, a trend amongst young Jews, young assimilated Jews, to be anti-Israel.
How can you be anti-Israel?
They are.
Because
It's so heartbreaking, but I have heard it. And they call themselves anti-Zionist.
yeah, of course, you have like the J Street group. J Streets, yeah. So that's political, quote-unquote, Jewish.
This must be
I never heard of it.
Yeah. So you have some of that, but I think that's still in the minority. You, of course, have those crazy lunatics that go and kiss Ahmadinejad. Those people that think that they're...
I don't get that.
Those are lunatics. Absolute lunatics.
Those lunatics felt that way because they didn't want
Because,
a
yeah.
nation before the coming of the Messiah.
Right, so that's what it's based on, but still, you don't go kiss enemies. Yeah. Even the people today that are anti-Zionism because of religious ideals, the overwhelming majority, 99.9% of them, don't conspire with the enemy. Like, even if you don't support Israel because of, you have religious problems with Israel the way it is currently constructed, okay, but doesn't mean you go fraternize with Arafat and go be part of his cabinet. Those are real absolute lunatics.
Well, I am not sure about it. And I'll tell you why. I met some Jews who think that we are an apartheid country.
We're what, apartheid?
Oh, apartheid.
Yeah, but that's also, they're not...
They are very, very much against whatever Netanyahu was trying to do.
Yeah, but those people, I'm saying no offense to them, but those people are not familiar with the definitions and the realities. Most of them probably never actually were in Israel, don't know the realities. How can you say it's an apartheid state when there's 13 Arab MKs, Chavrei Knesset? It's insane to say that.
I think they are following a little bit the left.
Yes. But either way, those are minorities. Those are minorities. Today, I look at Israel as, once again, even though slowly, we're 67 years in, today's the 67th anniversary of Israel. I look at it as slowly, means it's a process. Yes, this is going to be the fulfillment of the prophecies in Deuteronomy. I'm going to bring you back to Israel from the four corners of the world. This is it. Think about it. 67 years ago today, formation of the state of Israel, there were 600,000 Jews in Israel. That's it. Today, there's 6 million Jews. A tenfold increase. Slowly, it's taking some time, but there's a consolidation now. Right, the biggest community in the world of Jews is in Israel. But And yes, there's still friction between the different factions. There's still disagreements about various areas. And is it ideal? No. But it's moving very, very, not rapidly, but slowly but surely, it is getting closer and closer, in my opinion, to what it should look like. Where there's unity, where there's appreciation of the role that Israel has to play, of the nature of the Jewish state in what it's supposed to be. It's slowly coming together. And I think it's important for us to celebrate that because, as we know, our rights to Israel, and we do have rights to it, however, they're limited. They're contingent upon us being a certain quality of a nation, living with each other in a certain way, right? Being harmonious, right? Being united. And being united under the banner of what it means to be a Jew. Of the responsibilities that come with Jewish people living in Israel. And I think that we have room to grow, but I think we've come a very long way since the formation of the Zionist ideas and the radically different factions that propelled from different angles the state into existence. And you know what? I think we'd be very appreciative of it. You know, it's something that maybe we take for granted. Hopefully we don't. But today is a day to be appreciative of the fact that we know we have a state. It's our state. We may be living here. Our heart's in Israel, right? We have to support Israel, and eventually maybe even consider, we should all go home maybe, and it's actually also another pattern. Remember, Ezra leads the group. We said after the first temple destroyed, everyone goes to Babylon. The vast majority of them stay in Babylon 70 years later when Ezra comes and reestablishes the Jewish community in Israel. It's almost identical that 5% of the Jewish people came back to Israel with Ezra, and about 5% of the Jewish people were there at the beginning of the foundation of the state of Israel. But now, like we said, the vast majority, not the vast majority, but the biggest community of Jews, by around 40% of world Jewry, already lives in Israel. So I think that we're well on our way towards hopefully doing what we need to do collectively as a nation to coming to that pinnacle, to that reality of the Jewish people observing the Torah, right? Having the appreciation and the realization and the identity of the Jewish people in their most perfect sense, living in Israel, having harmony and unity. HaAtzmaut, everyone.
Great class.
So my great-grandfather in 1924,
yeah,
who had come to the United States from Ukraine, when did they come? 1910.
mm-hmm.
Lived in New York 14 years, wanted to go to Israel. So the mother refers to his wife as the mother. She wouldn't go. So he went down one morning to get milk.
Never came back.
And he never came home. And he lived in Israel. I have 3 pictures of him. He lived in
Mesharim. That was one of the oldest Jewish communities.
3 pictures of him. It's Torah.
Wow.
Standing. I mean, he lived in poverty. He always asked the sons, my grandfather and his brothers,
wow,
for money, and he lived there until 38 or 39.
Wow, that's pretty crazy.
Mesharim
is one of the oldest communities. It was a community founded in the very observant, but they're called like the Jerusalem, like the 9 generations of you're called Yerushalmis that have been living there. Very distinct clothing, like they've been there. Very beautiful. Very beautiful, like these brown, like cloaks, and or these the ones with the stripes and the white ones on the holiday. It's beautiful. Like, they have these beautiful clothing. Like it's it's not like the heavy like the looks like uncomfortable. It's like really nice and but that community has been around since the 1700s. Continually living there. And you walk through these alleys, and you can touch both sides of the street, like these cobblestone alleys that have been like that, and
It's like
people.
being in the old city, it's like that, right?
Yeah, old city as well. Anyhow, guys, we have a lot to be thankful for on this day. Thank you, everyone, guys.